Okay, CAN's Tago Mago, uh, released August 1971. And just so you know, guys, CAN is supposed to be all caps, not just like regular traditional way of spelling.
Best Ever
So,
Albums disagrees with that. They got it
well,
wrong.
they're best ever misspellings. CAN was created. This is the first time we're covering CAN, so I'll give a little bit of bio. I'm not going to go through their whole career. Just
Want some numbers first, Josh?
Yes, let's do that too.
Let's stick at 36 in the 1970s on Best Ever Albums, number 7 in the year 1971, number 145 of all time, and again, not making the Rolling Stone Top 500 list.
Okay. All right, thanks.
And it's also CAN's highest ranked album on Best Ever Albums as well.
I think it's generally considered their best album from what I saw as well.
Their magnum opus, if you will, Josh.
Yes,
Okay.
I think that was said.
Was it?
On one article. CAN was created by Ermin Schmidt, who is in the band, obviously. The idea came from Ermin Schmidt's trip to New York City in 1966, where he got caught up hanging out with all the avant-garde musicians and Andy Warhol music scene, and that kind of broke his brain, it seemed like, and made him discover kind of the possibilities of where rock music could go as a result. Up to this point, he was a kind of composer, a classical composer, and worked in that medium. And then he went back to Cologne, Germany, after his trip to New York City and formed this group with another composer, David Johnson, and a music teacher, Holger Zuke. All three of them were performing avant-garde classical music at this point, and he's quoted as saying that no one was talking about rock music as contemporary music in Europe. Contemporary music was thought of as just classical music and whatever the modern avant-garde classical composers were doing at that time. So I thought that was interesting. It's almost as if like there was no rock music in Europe or something, and it was confined to Britain and America.
And which years were these, Josh? Like
this was in the 60s.
In the 60s.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of the whole krautrock idea, right? Was they wanted to create another medium of music that wasn't tied to blues, right?
But like
blues
the
rock?
idea that the Beatles or the Stones or the Beach, like none of that was popular at all. Nothing like that's. It's interesting that like obviously the artists would be like, this is all nonsense, but like regular people like didn't like the Beatles or the Stones, like that just doesn't seem plausible.
Also, I wonder kind of the influence of like West Germany versus East Germany at this time, and kind of that separation and all of that stuff that was going on and how that was impacting.
That's true.
And everything.
It's also, you kind of have to be familiar with what Western music sounds like. And if you didn't grow up surrounded by a blues sound or a soul sound or an R&B sound like people in the United States did, or people in England kind of did, because there was so much exchange of culture between the two countries.
Because they're both English speaking too.
And so you might not have grown up with that around you, so it might not be as essential, as kind of my thought there.
Yep. So the original iteration of CAN when they formed was Schmidt on piano and organ, Zuke, he played bass and recorded all of the music for them on a 2-track tape machine. They had another person, Michael Carloy, on guitar, Jockey Liebezit on drums, and then David Johnson left shortly after this first formal iteration in 1968. Around September of 1968, they added an American named Malcolm Mooney as their vocalist, and he was kind of, let's say he was an unstable person, to put it, as admitted by himself too, or his history. Their first album was titled Monster Movie in 1969, and then Mooney left CAN in December of 1969 after his psychiatrist said that getting away from this music would be good for his mental health. So he really, you think David Bowie had a hard time. I guess he was really involved in avant-garde music. He was replaced in 1970 by Kenji Damo Suzuki. Damo's in quotes, or the single quotes, who they found busking in Munich. And busking, as Matt pointed out, is when you're performing on the street. And he is the vocalist that you hear on this album. Their second album, and their first with Suzuki, was titled Soundtracks, and was, I think, a soundtrack a movie or some type of thing. It doesn't seem like it was maybe an official type of album, but it's there. Suzuki would mostly sing in English, but sometimes also in Japanese, which I think you can hear on Tago Mago. Tago Mago was released in August of 1971, and it was recorded by Zuke in a castle that they were staying at called Schloss Norvenwich, which was a castle near Cologne, between November 1970 and February of 1971.
The early 70s was really peak
yeah.
ridiculousness in terms of sort of this excess, wasn't it? It's just, there's a lot of these. Yeah.
The other thing too is was the castle like specifically a recording studio, or was it just like a tourist place and they were like, let's just go what were they doing in the castle before?
I'm about to tell you.
Oh, okay, here we go.
They had been invited to stay there rent-free by an art collector who had bought the place or rented it, and was hoping to turn it into kind of an art collective, community art place or whatever like that.
Sounds like, what's that movie where the person invites the people and then ends up hunting them? That's what it sounds like, that type of, like, we're going to invite you here. Game. Yes, most dangerous, yeah. And then it's like suddenly you find out you're being hunted. Like, I feel like that could have easily been some of these bands, yeah.
Also, I find it amazing that somebody can just buy a castle. Like, that always, the castles to me just seem like they're owned by the government, that people just privately own them.
A uniquely European thing, having castles as an option to record in.
Yeah.
So recording took 3 months, and sometimes it took up to 16 hours a day. Zuke would edit these jams down into the tracks, and because of the limits of using two-track tape recorders, they would perform in the high-ceilinged entrance hall of this castle, to use kind of the acoustics of the castle to their advantage. And there was all sorts of things about like where they placed the microphones to best capture the sound, and so it wasn't a traditional recording studio is what I'm trying to get to. Zuke not only recorded their planned recordings, or like I guess the official tracks that they were trying to record, but also secretly recorded them during their pre-production jam sessions and just kind of figuring things out times, and he used that material as well to edit into the albums. The album is named after the Isle of Tago Mago off the east coast of Ibiza, or Ibiza if you are using the Spanish Catalan pronunciation of that sound.
Well played, Josh.
Yeah, thank you. The album blends funk rhythms, psychedelia, avant-garde noise, jazz improvisation, and electronic tape editing techniques into this album. The album took inspiration from jazz musicians like Miles Davis, and also there's the occultist Aleister Crowley plays into the narrative as well, and I think he was involved or lived on Tago Mago at one point, or he's somehow involved in that narrative. So it's all coming together for them there. Mm-hmm. Zuke said the album was, quote, an attempt in achieving a mystery musical world from light to darkness and return, and the group has referred to this album as their, quote, magic record. So this is a 2 LP album also, and with the second LP highlighting more of their avant-garde efforts. And also of note that Peking O, which is their second to last track on the second LP, made early use of a drum machine as well. This album is critically acclaimed and has been influential to many artists. John Lydon of the Sex Pistols has said it's influenced him. Bobby Gillespie of the Jesus and Mary Chain / Primal Scream has said that, and I think Jesus and Mary Chain also covered one of the songs on this record on one of their albums I saw. Mark Hollis of Talk Talk, who I'm not familiar with. And
yes you are.
Oh,
you know their songs. Do you know
Okay.
It's My Life by No Doubt, that song, the cover?
Oh yes, okay.
Mm-hmm. They have lots too. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
And then, no surprise after I saw this, Tom York and Johnny Greenwood of Radiohead also credit them as influences. I heard Radiohead a lot on this album. And finally, this album has been described as Can's best and, quote, most extreme record in sound.
This is their Mountain Dew album.
Yeah.
Yeah. So put in like a hard guitar riff there, Josh.
Yeah. So, Matt, do you think this is the Poochie of Can's albums? What did you think of hearing this?
I can't compare this to Can's other albums because I don't know any of them, and I did not know this. So going into it, I had no idea what to expect. I knew it was going to be different, and I was pleasantly surprised when I listened to the first song. I was like,
they lulled you into thinking, okay,
I was like, this is way more accessible than I thought it would be. I love the first track. It's like I said, it's got that cross between it's definitely offbeat or a little it's experimental, right? It's not traditional, but it's also got enough in there to it's melodic enough. I wouldn't say it's a terribly melodic song, but there's melodic elements to it. The beats, the drumming to it, was very catchy and appealing, and I really liked it. And for the next couple of songs, I was like, okay, I really like this. And Hallelujah comes up, and I loved that song. I was like, I'm in the kitchen list. I'm just like, this is just, and it goes on for like, I don't know, 5 or 6 minutes. I was like, okay, this is pretty good, and it kind of fades out. Like at the 7-minute mark or something like that. And then it comes back in. I was like, oh, I thought it was over. And I look and I'm like, oh shoot, I got 12 more minutes of this left or something like that. And that was great. And I loved it. And then it took a left turn.
Yes, the start of the second LP.
Omgun, or whatever the next track is. It's 17 and a half minutes of. It's like Revolution, and the same thing with Peking O. It's like Revolution 9 type stuff. It's just all experimentation. It's like moaning and like these voices kind of coming in and out. It's basically unlistenable, right? I listened to it once. I've listened to this album several times, and after I think I might have listened to it the whole way through twice, and after that I would just skip those 2 tracks because I'm like, it's not. There's nothing I need to listen to this more to figure out, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's not like, oh, maybe if I listen to it a third time, I'll get it. No, I'm not going to get it. I don't listen to Revolution 9 anymore, and I'm not going to listen to those songs. Bring Me Coffee or Tea, the last track comes back, and it's a little bit more along the lines of the beginning. So I kind of see what you're saying about, light into dark, and then back into light again. So overall, I liked it a lot. I am totally throwing away those other 2 tracks, though, because to me, that's just not maybe it's influential, maybe it's something that people said like, oh, this is going to be cool because this is a way that we can use the studio and other ways and things like that. This is something that we can incorporate it. But when you do it for a combined total of that's got to be 40 minutes almost right there, of just all those. I don't want to listen to that, So it actually it's probably more like a half hour. Sorry, 17:37 and 11:37, but still. Way too much. I don't need to listen to that. But all the other stuff was great. It's kind of really in my wheelhouse, kind of that indie, like that indie avant-garde rock kind of stuff that's got really good. The drumming's great. There's no hooks, there's no strong melodies, but there's a lot of interesting and catchy enough stuff going on that made me really like it. And I think we cover a couple more albums of theirs, so I'm interested to hear those as well. But aside from those 2 songs, I was a fan of this. It was different, and I'm glad I listened to it.
All right. What about you, John?
So the historian in me can say that, this calls back to the mothers of invention and Frank Zappa with the tape, the tape playback and tricks being done in the recording, and certainly White Light, White Heat and Trout Mask Replica in terms of sort of the music concrete, right? Stuff like that. And I can talk about how in the late 70s, the ambient music, the continuing of krautrock obviously has fathers to this. Noise rock, certainly in the 80s. You mentioned Jesus and Mary Chain, Josh, which absolutely I can see how that was an influence for them. My Bloody Valentine, Sonic Youth, right? And then in the early 2000s, what Radiohead was doing certainly had stuff like this. And so absolutely, when they talk about it being a highly influential album, I can definitely see why. I fucking hated this album. I never want to listen to it again. I don't care if that takes away my credibility. I don't want to listen to 73 minutes of art pieces. And I like to think of myself as open-minded. But to me, this album should have been a 25-minute album. If it was a 25-minute album, I probably would have been fascinated by this album. I think when an album gets to 73 minutes doing this, it's just, no. It's too much. I don't need that much. It loses the desire for me to delve into it. And I think that a lot of these pieces would just be better as 20 to 30-minute pieces, maybe multiple pieces that you can dive into individually. But when you throw all of this together, it just seems excessive. It has no replay value for me. And I know there's people right now that can tell me what's going on. And I don't doubt that I'm minimizing the sounds that are here. And like I said, I absolutely can see the evolution of what they're going for. I don't even think that I don't necessarily not get what they're going for. It just, there has to, for me, be a level of replayability and wanting to listen to it. And by the second time I was listening to this album, it was just an academic exercise at that point. I tried. But it just it's a lot of things I don't like. I mean, I appreciate, reverse dubbing on tape, doing stuff as a parlor trick. But once again, maybe for pieces of a song here and there, but when you're constantly doing it, it wears me out. Pieces that are going 18 minutes, 17 minutes, 11 minutes and 43 seconds. With just ambient sound. Once again, if you're making me a 4-minute piece, sure, but when we're getting into 18, it's just a lot to keep up with. I know that makes me an unsophisticated listener, but if you've been listening to me long enough, I'm not particularly worried about sometimes not getting certain stuff. I don't want to sound anti-intellectual, but it wasn't even as interesting to me sonically as Faust was. Where there were some things they were doing that kind of caught my attention as almost like a science experiment. I did notice there was also, the percussion was interesting on this album, because sometimes it almost went, I felt like, into almost like a Latin American, African drum feel at times, but mixed with just that music concrete sound. I also think this is the type of album that if you are more a creator of music, you hear this a different way. That I'm very aware of myself, that I get that I don't hear it at that level. I'm interested always to hear people who hear it that way, and it very much interests me intellectually, but sonically it has nothing for me. So this one is a big thumbs down for personal preference for me. Maybe not as low as Trout Mask Replica, maybe right there with White Light, White Heat. Just a difficult album that just wasn't difficult for me in the right ways. I also feel like this type of music, when we got to the 80s, the revisions made to the sound by the bands in the 80s just connect with me so much more. And we'll cover a lot of that noise rock and stuff, and it's going to sound weird to hear me praise some of that stuff while I'm not here. So I'll try to extrapolate on that when we get there, but just not doing it for me.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you love Sonic Youth, and you can kind of see the line from this to Sonic Youth. So
I love Jesus and Mary Chain, and I can absolutely see the line. Yep.
My Bloody Valentine you like too, don't you?
Yeah,
I do.
Yeah, interesting. So it's hard. I'll try and be not as extreme on my review of this album, but it's hard to like a band when you only like half of the album, and that's the first half that's more accessible. I wrote down the exact same thing that John said. I increasingly feel like these avant-garde albums are designed only for other musicians, and those are the only people that appreciate them. People that understand either like how to write music or can read music or just understand the kind of ways that music comes together, and I think those are the only people that can appreciate the second LP on this album, for example, which has gibberish vocals on Peking O. There's screaming and yelling, I think, and chanting on Ogum. There's it reminds me of the Sesame Street Yip Yip Aliens on Ogum at one point. Ehrman's doing the vocals on that one, so it's not even Suzuki, and he's like, I thought about doing a funny impression of that as my opening welcome, but I just can't do it justice. And so, but like Matt said, I really liked the first LP of this, and kind of lured me in the same way. I thought, oh man, okay, this isn't so avant-garde, what's going on here? And then you get blasted in the face by the second LP. I kind of like the repetition that they go through on the first part of the album, especially like Mushroom Head I keep calling it Mushroom Head when it's really called Mushroom. And,
what's on your mind, Josh?
Yeah.
well, that's one of the quotes. He's like, when I saw Mushroom Head, am I alive or am I dead? And his vocals aren't totally coherent right from the get-go on Paper House, which is the first track. It's kind of like muted vocals, and because I think he's a non-native English speaker, he's kind of got the Japanese accent on his English as well. But I do kind of like the repetitive rhythmic structure of the song. I think Hallelujah is, I mean, this may be high praise, but I think that's kind of one of my favorite long songs that there are, just because of you kind of get into a trance listening to it, and it's got this cool like funk beat to it, or backbone to it, and there's some interesting guitar parts into it, and for some reason I was just on its level when I was listening to it, and the percussion is pretty solid. His drumming, that repetitive drumming, is pretty what's his name, Leibowitz, I think, or Liebezeit is the drummer, and I noticed the percussion on this album, at least on the first part, and I heard Tom York. I heard Suzuki, and he sounded like Tom York a little bit on Mushroom, and I also hear Twin Peaks musical scoring with like the bombs exploding and the gibberish vocals and things like that. So I'm not surprised. Would be surprised if David Lynch was influenced, or gosh, who did I don't know how. I mean, he was involved with the music, but
Angelo.
Yes,
Badalamenti.
Yes,
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, he was probably involved as well too, and so yeah, it's hard to say. You can hear the influences, everything that I said. You can hear the funk, the psychedelia is definitely on that first track, Paper House. I feel like that is a clear influence from some of the bands that John mentioned that we've listened to before, and so they definitely seem like they're exploring and doing all of these things that they've come back with and trying to put it into their own album. But if you're just trying to do your own spin on those things, I'm not sure that's strong enough recommendation for me to go on. I think the true Can is probably that second LP, right? It's the first parts maybe more of them dabbling and experimenting, and what they're really interested in is the stuff on the second LP.
Well, and it's hard to, and I'm going to save this discussion for when we do Kraftwerk, and we do Can again too, so I'll be interested. But it's hard to describe how out of the tradition of Western music this krautrock sound is. It's classical music mixed with its own musical ambiance, I think, and it is just divorced from blues and R&B, which so much of the music we listen to is. And I'm very aware of that when I listen, and so I try not to be biased against something that doesn't sound like that.
Right.
But if you are not ready for that, it's going to be a very, very challenging listen for you. And I almost feel like I'm going into the classroom with these albums to just get the sound, and I feel like it's going to continue to be lecture hall level with Faust, Can, Kraftwerk, but also to some degree Roxy Music, Brian Eno, what Bowie's doing later. There's going to be a lot of that where we're going to get to hear sort of an overview of all of the works that are most thought of. And it's going to be like with free jazz in the 60s, right? It's going to be a learning experience, and I'll be interested to see how we all feel at the end. Do we have landmarks? Do we find we like some of it? Do we, Yeah.
Well, I'm already finding that I like, because I did like this, much more than like the Eric Dolphy album. That's always what I go back to. That was a hard listen for me, and it does stand to reason that this is, this would not be for everybody. I think it's, like I said, I think I was intrigued by the fact that I wasn't turned off from it right off the beginning. Actually, I liked a lot of it, and I was like, I thought the whole thing was going to be like this, and I was going, oh man, 73 minutes of this, I could do that. Like, it's long, and I get it why it might be too much for some people, but I was really into it. And then that second side kicked in, and I was like, okay, I don't need that. You know, I just yeah, I don't even know if you can call that. I'm listening to that second side. I'm going, is this music? I mean, can you even call, like, what is this? You know, it's just, I don't know. I don't get that. To me, I think you could just listen to the first half. You know, unless you really wanted to go into a bunch of noise and just see what experimentation can sound like. You know, there's probably people out there that might be into that. But if you cut those two tracks off, this is like a 44, 45-minute album, and you're getting a little bit more in the realm of now it's only 5 songs. So, you know, so it's long, but, you know,
4 songs, right?
Well, I throw the last track on there is Bring Me Coffee or Tea is kind of, to me, is more in line with the first part of the record. Mm-hmm. So I would say listen to that as well. But, yeah, it's certainly different. But it does harken back to, you know, looking at the influence that it had on some of those other acts like Radiohead. It makes total sense what they're doing with like in Kid A and Amnesiac in particular, like you said, John. It's very, yeah, you could see that this is something that, you know, was really intriguing them at that time. So, yeah, certainly not for everybody, but I personally, I was surprised at that first half. I was like, I like this. This is it's different, but I liked it.
So that kind of begs the question. Also, because you like both of those Radiohead albums, where's the separation there between that and this? Because they're both, you know, tied together in the same way that Sonic Youth is tied to this.
Yeah, but I think this is much more like those Radiohead albums in terms of direct correlation than. I don't know how familiar you guys are with 80 Sonic Youth and Jesus and Mary Chain, but yes, there's elements of it, but it is not this sparse.
Yeah.
You know, it's just, whereas the Kid A and Amnesiac are sparse albums. And I don't know. I see that a direct connection more with those albums than I do. I don't know. What do
I
you
don't know
think?
if I would call those albums. I think there's sparse moments in those albums. I don't know if overall they're
right.
sparse. There's
fair.
songs that are pretty much like the National Anthem and Idiotech are very produced and a lot of stuff going on. But the bleeps and the bloops and the kind of, you know, like the non-musical parts, there's certainly non-musical parts in those albums.
I believe that's what I call Kid A, right? Bleeps and bloops was what I used to refer to Kid A as.
Yeah, there's like
used to drive Matt nuts.
There's like 3 guitar chords, I think, in the entire record or something like that. But yeah, and I'm not even. Historically, I'm not a huge. I don't really know a ton of those other bands like Jesus and Mary Chain or My Bloody Valentine.
Well, do you know noise rock? It's noise rock.
Yeah, I do, but I don't feel like that's something that there's like a band out there that I listen to a lot of it. I think there's aspects of it that I like. Like there's been some My Bloody Valentine stuff that I've heard that I've liked, and but Sonic Youth traditionally is not something that's done a whole lot for me. So it's interesting how it's kind of working in different ways from us, but it all does come from here. But then again, rock and roll all comes from the same place, like the blues, and there's rock and roll that we really like and rock and roll that we don't, you know, so it's not like this is holding the candle for, you know, or the torch for just like, this is the genre that, and if you like this, then you're going to like all these other things, because people do different things with it. That's what they do. They take ideas and they put spins on it. They add things, they take things away, and they make it their own. And so yeah, it's very plausible to like the one direction, but over another. So, but yeah, this is to me this was a great one album.
Yeah.
Well, and my last take I think will be, I'm actually very glad that music like this exists, because I like the idea of pushing definitions of things. And, you know, music, a lot of how we define it is probably defined by, with whether we realize it or not, certain sounds that we think are what created music, right? But this is just basically rejecting that idea and saying, no, maybe classical music and then this other aesthetic we've listened to is what music is, you know, sounds and sonic imprints. So I do respect that. But at the end of the day, this is a music reaction show to some degree, and I'd be lying if I said that I had a positive reaction to this. Well, so I got to be honest.
the cool thing with this can be when somebody takes this and then puts it in a more contemporary, Western, I will say, Germany's Western, but like more of a rock based or blues based American type sound.
But that's what noise rock is. That's what they did. Yeah.
Right, and incorporating it. So yeah, that makes sense of what you're saying, is because you want stuff like this to exist because people can do. It doesn't have to exist in a vacuum. It can be done in different ways. So
yeah, I guess when you can't really appreciate Can without listening to that second LP, right? Or understand Can, I should say. It may be a more pleasurable listening experience to listen to the first part of this album, but you're not going to understand anything we're talking about if you don't force yourself to listen to that second part. It's also, I guess my other final thought would be, it's like hearing traditional like Japanese or Chinese music for the first time, or any type of Asian music that you're unfamiliar with. It's a completely different foundation. It's a completely different musical instruments, and also like pattern, right? And so it catches you off guard, and it sounds very foreign when you're used to hearing it, blues based or jazz based music, American music. And so it's the same thing around the world, right? Any music that is completely different foundation and is separate from the music that came from Western type of music is going to sound different and be a different experience than that. So yeah, that's to say that's why it's important to listen to those types of things, and that's why all these musicians, often seek out those types of things from, Africa, from all around the world, because they are influenced by those and get appreciation from those and pull those into their music. So yeah, interesting listening experience overall, but not like my highest recommendation.